Something is happening to you that's hard to explain. Not because it's confusing, but because it doesn't seem to fit into any simple word. You wake up. The day begins the way it always has. Nothing changed in a dramatic way. But when you try to connect with the things that used to pull you into life, something doesn't respond. It's not aversion. It's not clear sadness. It's a strange kind of neutrality. As if what once moved through you now passes right by, without leaving a mark. You pick up a book that once held you for hours, and it feels heavy in your hands in a different way. Not because of its content, but because of the absence of desire. You enter conversations that once flowed naturally and realize you're present only in your body. Your mind no longer engages in the same way. And the strange part isn't that this happened. It's how long it took you to notice. Even goals that once felt urgent, necessary, almost inevitable, now sound distant. As if they were imagined by someone else. In another phase. With another level of awareness. You start to wonder if you're becoming cold. Or too tired. Or if something inside you broke, without making a sound. Maybe you've thought, I should be more excited about this. Or, this should mean more to me. But it doesn't. And the more you try to force that old feeling of enthusiasm, the more artificial everything feels. The effort begins before the action even starts. And just the idea of trying already feels exhausting. This didn't start now. It just became impossible to ignore now. Because when nothing excites you anymore, the question isn't only what's leaving. It's what you're trying to keep even though it no longer fits. At some point, this feeling stops being just strange and starts to feel frightening. Because when interest disappears, the mind doesn't think in terms of transition. It thinks in terms of failure. You begin to watch yourself with suspicion, as if you're looking for a new flaw you don't yet know how to name. You try to label it. Fatigue, stress, lack of discipline. Maybe even depression, even without clear sadness, even without despair, even while continuing to function. And that only makes it more confusing. Because you wake up, work, reply to messages, do what needs to be done. Nothing has collapsed on the outside. But on the inside, motivation no longer shows up to sustain all of this. You start comparing yourself to people who still seem excited. Who talk about plans with light in their eyes. Who want more. And quietly, a question appears that you avoid saying out loud. Why doesn't this work for me anymore? You try to fix yourself. Sleep better. Change your routine. Force habits that once worked. But now none of that reaches the exact place where something stopped responding. Because if this were just exhaustion, rest would fix it. But what if resting doesn't bring anything back? What if the problem isn't a lack of energy, but the end of a kind of interest that has already served its purpose? Then fear changes shape. It's no longer fear of being unwell. It's fear of changing without knowing where you're going. And maybe the heaviest thought is this. What if I never feel what I used to feel again? Not exaggerated excitement, but that simple feeling of wanting to be there. And this is where many people panic. Not because they lost something, but because they realize they no longer know who they are without what they lost. And what if the problem isn't this lack of interest, but the way you're trying to explain it? What if, for the first time, you suspended the idea that this is a problem? Not to deny what you're feeling, but to stop trying to fix something before you've even understood what changed. Because maybe what's happening isn't a loss of interest. Maybe it's a withdrawal. Not something being taken from you, but something within you stopping its effort to hold up what no longer holds on its own. You notice this when you try to insist. When you force presence where there's no real engagement. When you make yourself want what once came naturally. Nothing responds. And the discomfort doesn't come from emptiness. It comes from the effort of keeping it filled with things that no longer return energy. There's a subtle but decisive difference between losing something and continuing to invest where there is no longer any return. And what if this emptiness you're trying to fill isn't a hole, but a space? A space created not by failure, but by precision. Something in you recalculated, silently, without asking for your permission. And maybe the question now isn't, how do I go back to feeling what I felt before? But whether you're willing not to interfere with what has already begun to reorganize. Think of a system that needs to grow, but no longer fits its old structure. Before change becomes visible, something starts to fail on the inside. Not because of a defect, but because of a limit. Energy stops circulating where it once flowed easily. Not because the path became wrong, but because it became too narrow. Every intelligent system does this. It doesn't collapse first. It withdraws investment. When something needs to be updated, the system doesn't trigger alarms. It reduces compatibility. What once ran on its own begins to stall. Requires more energy to deliver less return. Not because it's broken, but because it can no longer support the expansion trying to happen. This is how a real transition announces itself. Not through the birth of the new, but through the rising cost of the old. Interest doesn't disappear all at once. It simply becomes too expensive to sustain. And forcing continuity doesn't fix it. It only overloads the system. No system grows by trying to operate indefinitely with the same structure. At some point, it has to stop. Create space. And the discomfort doesn't come from the pause. It comes from trying to keep functioning as if nothing were changing. Maybe what you call emptiness isn't absence, but an interval. If nothing were reorganizing, nothing would have stopped responding. This is where disinterest is usually misinterpreted. Because it's treated as lack, when in reality it functions as a filter. Nothing disappears by accident. When something stops attracting you, it's because the internal cost of keeping it active has become too high. The system doesn't collapse. It conserves. And it does that by withdrawing interest. Not because that thing is bad. Not because it lost its value. But because it no longer speaks to what you're becoming. That's why certain conversations start to feel exhausting. They aren't empty, they just no longer reach you. That's why activities that once held your attention now feel too long. Not because they got worse, but because they demand an energy that no longer comes back. Even old goals fall into this. What once felt urgent now sounds distant. Not because you lost ambition, but because that ambition was built for a different version of you. Here, disinterest is not giving up. It's recalibration. Something in you starts asking, silently, is this still worth what it costs? And when the answer becomes no, enthusiasm no longer shows up to sustain the effort. Forcing interest, then, turns into exhaustion. You keep going, but the body doesn't follow. The mind can't sustain it. And the emptiness shows up afterward. Not as a cause. As a consequence. Ignoring this signal doesn't keep everything the same. It just shifts the cost somewhere else. Disinterest is the first sign that your internal system has become more selective. And when the filter changes, what starts to bother you isn't the emptiness, it's what's still taking up space without giving anything back. This is where many people get lost. Because when interest disappears, the automatic reaction is to try to go back. Back to the old pace. To the routines that used to work. To versions of yourself that once felt easier to sustain. You tell yourself it's just a phase. That you just need to push a little longer. That everything will fall back into place soon. And for a while, it even works. But something starts to charge a price. Not an immediate price. Not a visible one. Not a dramatic one. A silent cost. You keep doing what you've always done, but the wear shows up before the result. What used to tire you afterward now tires you beforehand. What once came with pleasure now requires effort. And the problem isn't the effort. It's the return. Because the return has diminished. You invest the same energy, but receive less presence, less meaning, less vitality. And this doesn't fail all at once. It accumulates. As irritation with no clear cause. As impatience. As a desire to pull away without knowing exactly from what. That's how the invisible cost works. It doesn't stop you from continuing. It just makes everything heavier. Until insisting starts to cost more than stopping. And after that point, going back never gives back what it took. Because trying to go back feels like courage. But sometimes, it's just resistance to what has already changed. You don't realize you're exhausting yourself trying to support a structure that no longer supports itself. And the body signals it. The mind scatters. Enthusiasm withdraws completely. Not as punishment, as a warning. Because continuing to insist doesn't preserve who you were. It only delays who you're becoming. And what if the real risk isn't changing, but continuing to pay this cost until there's no energy left to choose? This is where the most dangerous confusion appears. Because when interest drops and enthusiasm doesn't return, the first explanation that comes up is the heaviest one. Depression, not because someone told you that, but because it's the most available name when something stops working inside. But there's an important difference that almost no one teaches you to notice. Depression weighs you down, it paralyzes, it closes things off. The feeling is stagnation, repetition with no exit, a shortened sense of future. What you're experiencing is different. Even if it's uncomfortable, something is still moving. Even without enthusiasm, there is sensitivity. You notice more, you tolerate less. You get tired faster than before, not from weakness, but from excess noise. In depression, the world loses color. In transition, the world loses tolerance for the superficial. In depression, life feels distant. In transition, life feels too demanding to keep being lived the same way. There is emptiness in both, but the texture is different. One is heavy, the other is spacious. One sinks, the other suspends. And that matters. Because treating transition as depression is trying to fix something that is, in fact, reorganizing itself. It's trying to numb a system that is recalibrating sensitivity. You didn't lose the ability to feel. You lost the ability to engage with what no longer vibrates at the same level. And that doesn't mean something is wrong, it means something became more precise. Maybe the clearest sign of this isn't what you feel, but what you can no longer sustain by pretending. And what if this discomfort isn't a symptom to eliminate, but a new criterion forming inside you? After some time, something starts to become clear. The emptiness doesn't stay still. It begins to organize itself. And this shows up in small, but persistent signs. You notice that you can no longer sustain certain conversations. Not because they're wrong, but because they sound too shallow for the state you're in. What used to go unnoticed now bothers you. Superficiality is tiring. Repetition feels heavy. A greater need for silence emerges. Not as escape, but as listening. External noise starts to compete with something internal that's trying to take shape. You begin to need more space. More time without stimulation. Less demand for immediate response. And that can be frightening. Because it doesn't look like expansion. It looks like withdrawal. But you're not isolating yourself. You're filtering. Limits start to appear without planning. Invitations you once accepted automatically now ask for meaning. Not because of lack of energy, but because of lack of alignment. Even the body responds differently. It asks for rest sooner, refuses excess with less tolerance. Not because you became fragile, but because you became more precise about the cost of things. And alongside that, new interests begin to appear. Nothing explosive, nothing urgent, just quiet curiosities, pulls without a clear explanation. You don't know where they lead. You only feel that you need to look. These signs are not distractions. They are indicators of direction. Still without form. Still without a name. Because before something new becomes clear, it begins as a change in what you can no longer sustain. There's one detail that changes how all of this is understood. You're not without direction. You're without distraction. Before, enthusiasm filled the gaps. Goals occupied your time. Movement created the feeling of progress. Now, without that, silence has become visible. And what feels uncomfortable isn't the absence of interest. It's the presence of what you couldn't hear before. When distraction falls away, the system stops cushioning. You begin to feel the real weight of what you carry, of what consumes you, of what takes up space without giving meaning back. That's why it feels like emptiness. But it isn't. It's exposure. Exposure to what was always there, but stayed covered by urgency, by expectation, by noise. You didn't lose desire. You lost the noise that masked what was never true desire. And that changes everything. Because now you can no longer deceive yourself so easily. You can't artificially motivate yourself anymore. You can't pretend alignment. Not because you became weak, but because you became lucid. And lucidity doesn't offer new distractions. It simply removes the old ones. That's why returning to autopilot stops being a real option. The discomfort didn't come to stop you. It came to prevent you from continuing toward a place you no longer fit. And what if this silence isn't an empty interval, but the first moment in which you're truly seeing what once had to be avoided? After distraction falls away, something inevitable happens. The way you recognized yourself starts to lose its reference. Not because you got lost, but because what confirmed who you thought you were stopped responding. Before, your identity came from movement, from what you did, from what you pursued, from what kept everything in motion. Now, without that, those automatic answers fail. And discomfort appears. Because when enthusiasm disappears, when goals no longer pull, when the old rhythm no longer holds, the question changes. It's no longer, what do I want? Or, what should I do? It becomes, who am I when I'm not trying to be anything? This is where many people rush. They try to redefine themselves quickly, create new labels, choose directions too soon. But recalibration doesn't happen that way. Before a new form can be assumed, something has to loosen. As long as you keep recognizing yourself by what you used to do, the new cannot appear. It doesn't compete with the old. It waits for space. And that space is uncomfortable because it doesn't offer a ready-made identity. It doesn't tell you who you are. It only makes clear who you can no longer be. And maybe that's the hardest part to sustain. Not knowing exactly who you're becoming, but knowing with precision what no longer fits. That isn't failure. It's transition. A transition in which identity is not created through effort, but adjusted through removal. And the less you try to explain yourself, the clearer it becomes what is beginning to align inside. Because when you stop defining yourself by what you used to do, something more truthful finally finds space. Not every emptiness is loss. Sometimes, it's simply what remains when what was never essential finally falls away. You are not late, you are not broken, you are not failing. You are between versions. And this space doesn't ask for urgency. It doesn't ask for definition, it doesn't ask for explanation. It asks for respect. Because trying to force meaning now is the fastest way to move away from what is trying to align. Maybe you don't need to understand this moment. Maybe you only need not to interrupt what has already begun. Maybe nothing needs to change right now. Maybe what matters most has already changed. And you just don't have words for it yet. No direction, no shape, no name. Only the feeling that going back no longer works, and moving forward hasn't appeared yet. That isn't a mistake. It's a pause. And pauses don't exist to be filled. They exist so that something can be heard. If this video found you now, it isn't here to push you. It's here so that you don't go back out of reflex. Because what comes after this silence doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to listening.